Well, it's still good morning. So welcome to our next session on lifetime surveillance. This session is going to be moderated by Dr. Michael Barrett, and it's my privilege to introduce him. So first of all, just let me give you some background on some commonality we have here. When I went to train in Russia for the first docking flight as a backup crew member, Mike was a pretty newly minted flight surgeon, but he was assigned to come to Russia. We also have a commonality in a Huskies at the University of Washington, but he went on to get a doctorate of medicine at Northwestern and then a master's at Wright State. He's completed his residency in internal and aerospace medicine, and he came to NASA in 1991. Worked as a flight surgeon supporting us, and then applied as an astronaut, was selected in the year 2000. He performed 2 space station tours, expeditions 19 and 20, and then he was on the space shuttle STS-133 in 2011 and one of the last shuttle flights. He's the associate editor for space medicine for the Journal of the Aerospace Medicine and Human Performance, and is a lead editor for the textbook Principles of Clinical Medicine in Spaceflight. And then if you're interested in helping him, he'd like to help rewrite Guyton's textbook on human physiology for variable G environments, and love to help you. So with that, I introduce Dr. Mike Barrett.
All right, thanks very much, Bonnie, and go Dogs. Washington State actually really rocks in space, and we've got 2 of our newer young rock stars in the astronaut office, Kayla Barron and Ann McLean, both from Washington State, so certainly a point of pride there. I have to point out that I think ISMS this year is arguably more important than in prior years, since we really haven't had other chances for interaction or bringing this community together, whether they be the deliberate meetings such as the Aerospace Medical Association or some of the more operational meetings that tend to bring us together. So anyway, welcome to the Lifetime Surveillance Panel. I will babble on for just about 3 or 4 minutes or so to try to put this subject in context of today's spaceflight realities. Jason, are you trying to talk to me?
No.
Okay. Try to bring this into context with the new spaceflight realities and the old ones as well, and hopefully kind of set the stage for our panel members. Now, really quick, we use the term lifetime surveillance very deliberately, and I'll steal a sentence from the Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health website. LSAH is a proactive occupational surveillance program for the astronaut corps to screen and monitor astronauts for occupationally related injury or disease. So this is formally from the NASA program, but I think the term and the context are very generic for all agencies and programs. And I would say that applies to the commercial enterprises as well that are newly emerging. The collection of lifetime surveillance data actually begins when an individual's spaceflight career begins and continues well after that career ends. My very humble and sincere hope is that it ends after a rich and full life and an autopsy for each crew member. And we say that very carefully, but we also say that very meaningfully. Now, as for any occupational surveillance program, we're looking for both short-term and long-term health outcomes, and these have to be based on deliberate metrics. So these in turn have then to be vetted against discrete identifiable occupational risk factors, at least the ones that we know well enough to identify. So for us, that could be physical stresses, acceleration loads, exposure to weightlessness, radiation, toxic agents, anything we might encounter during our research that we conduct. Now we add variable atmospheres, surface EVA, dust, and all of that indeed has to be vetted against a set of spaceflight related metadata. You need all of this really to make quantified and meaningful associations. So we ask a lot of our health surveillance program. In the short term, we might be looking real time at this data to help differentiate crew members that report symptom or sign X, if you will, from those that are doing the same flight but not reporting the same issues. And we're trying to determine causation or the firmness of association. Carbon dioxide induced headaches come immediately to mind because we see that. We're trying to twig out what's real and what's not. And the implications are very expensive from the standpoint of hardware and systems. Now, in the long term, extending after a crew member's flight career. But we can't expect to understand the complete human response to spaceflight without that lifetime tracking of health outcomes, since many effects linger, those that we understand and certainly those that we do not understand. So the observation of classic SANS findings in a Skylab astronaut, for instance, after decades, I think is a great example, and that has been publicly reported. Also note that we impose flight career limits on certain exposures, think radiation, based on theoretical long-term health outcomes. So mainly radiation with respect to cancer risk. So this places a great imperative on thoughtful data tracking and analysis to regress against those health outcomes. And I would also say that inherently this implies a generational commitment to this lifetime surveillance notion. And now we have some new twists. Spaceflight opportunities in the spaceflight population are expanding. I think people are aware of that with new commercial vehicles, new programs. It won't just be agencies flying people anymore. So it's more important than ever for this expanding public to be informed to the fullest extent possible about the holistic health risks. And we hope that this new cadre of flyers will want to help in this effort as well. So there may be some opportunities here. I believe that this is a public need to know, and that sentiment should be shared both amongst the agencies and the commercial enterprises. And we now find ourselves returning back to the moon, where we have very scant and decades old experience. And on the moon, we're going to some very challenging places compared to what we did during the Apollo era. Topography, thermal flux, lighting, everything is going to be harder, but those are the more interesting places. So once again, we're in this learn as you go period, just like they were in the Gemini Apollo timeframe. And we certainly find ourselves skittering back to look at that data frequently. So I would say that everything unique about these times can be filtered through the collection of information on human health metrics. And I would also emphasize that with our recent experience base on ISS, finding things we didn't expect, I would argue that we have to think consciously and deliberately about collecting and organizing data with really two main thoughts in mind. First, of course, you're trying to analyze and vet data for what you are looking for, things that you know are risks, such as ionizing radiation and cancer risk. But second, I would say being able to analyze data for what we are not looking for is equally important for the next new finding that may not yet be on our imagination's radar. But when that does pop up, and I guarantee you it will, we'll need to track that against other health metrics and mission metadata to make sense of it all. So I think SANS and venous thrombosis issues are great examples of that. So we have assembled a panel, and thank you in advance to all, that will unpack several different aspects of lifetime surveillance and hopefully provoke some thought and curiosity as well as informing the community. So it's my pleasure to introduce them one by one, and I'll introduce and then let them give some words on their chosen topic. And we will start with Dr. Rebecca Reed. Dr. Reed was named Assistant Director of the Human Health and Performance Directorate and Manager of Crew Health and Safety Program in May of this year. She is in this position responsible for NASA's Astronaut Occupational Health Program and oversees implementation of the TREAT Astronauts Act at the NASA Johnson Space Center. Now, some of you may know that after years of working at this in late 2016, Congress did pass what's known as the TREAT Act. TREAT is a horrible acronym in true NASA fashion, but I think this was our congressional work. To research, evaluate, assess, and treat astronauts. And after a mandatory year and a little bit more of study, this is actually ongoing and fielded now. So we're in an early implementation phase. So Dr. Reed will talk about that. I will mention that she has a PhD from Georgetown and a jurisprudence doctorate from the University of Houston Law Center, and is just a month away from completing an LLM in health law in the University of Houston's Health Law and Policy program. So over to you, Dr. Reed.
Thank you, Dr. Barrett. Hopefully y'all can see me. Looks like I may be frozen on my screen, so hopefully I'm not on yours. So thank you. You did a great job explaining the acronym, which, you know, if you're around NASA, we have lots of acronyms. But as Dr. Barrett said, in March 2017, the TREAT Astronauts Act was signed into law. It did pass earlier that year through Congress. And as he said, TREAT stands for to research, evaluate, assess, and treat. So what the act did was to authorize NASA to expand on the current medical monitoring services that have been provided by the longitudinal study of astronaut health for many years, and to provide diagnostic and treatment services for conditions that are associated with spaceflight. And the words associated with spaceflight are pretty important in the TREAT context. And we were authorized to do that without any cost-sharing obligation for the astronauts, such as a deductible or copayment. So there were two major goals for the legislation. The first was to fulfill our obligation to the astronauts to ensure appropriate care for long-term health conditions that are associated with their spaceflight training and experience, and to enable NASA's goal of returning to the moon and going on to Mars by expanding our understanding of the long-term health consequences of human spaceflight, and thereby making planetary exploration safer for our astronauts. This represents really an expansion of the exceptional work that LSAH has been doing for several decades. It's not something completely new. It just gives us a little more ability to provide additional monitoring and to support the treatment for spaceflight-associated conditions. I think really notably for our former astronaut population and for our understanding of the long-term health risks that may be experienced by our astronauts as they go on to Mars is that we're now able to offer behavioral health services to former astronauts, including comprehensive neurocognitive assessments that were recently developed by Dr. Carmen Pulido, who was hired specifically to provide these TREAT services to our former astronauts. We're also working with the human system risk teams to identify other needs for long-term surveillance. And Dr. Van Balen and her team of epidemiologists have done an exceptional job of looking across what sorts of risks we think are going forward and what kinds of monitoring we may need. And those things will continue to develop over time. So because we're a government bureaucracy, it wasn't enough that we passed a law. We also had to publish a rule. So NASA does not usually engage in formal rulemaking. We're not a regulatory agency, so this was an interesting process for all of us. But the team up in Ochmo did an exceptional job and put together a formal regulation, which was published as an interim final rule in the Code of Federal Regulations in March. They received some very helpful comments from the community, some from our former astronauts, and they're preparing to publish the final rule in the near future. So for those of you who are wondering why we haven't fully rolled out all the programs, we actually have to have this rule in place in order to do that. So I thought it would also be useful to talk very briefly about how you actually get TREAT coverage. It's a question that folks ask. So I think it's worth just quickly reviewing it. Accessing TREAT coverage works very much like requesting workers' compensation through the Department of Labor or Veterans Administration for any other kind of occupational injury or illness. So our former astronauts work with a dedicated workers' compensation specialist in the Flight Medicine Clinic at the Johnson Space Center. The clinic and the physicians there support the development of a case file. They provide a physician's opinion on whether the claim is related to the former astronauts' training and spaceflight. If the claim is accepted by the Department of Labor or the Veterans Affairs, NASA covers out-of-pocket expenses for the former astronaut that are not covered by their private insurer or by the Department of Labor or VA. If the claim is rejected by the Department of Labor or the VA, NASA provides an independent review of the claim through what's known as the TREAT Astronauts Act Board. This is a newly established board. It should be meeting for the first time in the near future. We're very grateful to Dr. Terry Taddeo for chairing it. It is an Ochmo board, but we hold it at JSC. The TAB board may elect to provide coverage if the board determines that the claimed condition is more likely than not to be caused by the astronaut's occupational exposures. So I did want to note that the LSAH annual exams, which I think Dr. Van Balen will probably talk at more length about, are a critical part of ensuring that we're able to provide adequate TREAT coverage to our former astronauts. We conducted 87 of them this fiscal year through March 2020 when COVID happened. And obviously with the travel restrictions on COVID, that significantly impacted our ability to to provide our normal screening exams to the astronauts. In a normal year, we expect about 190 former astronauts to come back for annual physicals. And then the data that they provide us is incredibly important, and it allows us to ensure that they are getting the care that we can provide to them. So Dr. Barrett, that's all I have for you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about the TREAT Act.
Okay, appreciate it. Thanks so much. And I've definitely written a couple of questions, but we'll try to get through everybody here. Let's go next to Dr. Jacqueline Charvat. Dr. Jacqueline Charvat is the Senior Epidemiologist for the Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health. This is again, our occupational surveillance group for the Astronaut Corps. Her background is in epidemiology of cardiovascular disease and cancer, which makes her perfectly suited for this role, I think. And in her current role, she evaluates the long-term health of astronauts, taking into account the health effects of astronauts' unique occupational exposures and the synergistic effects of aging. She'll be talking to us today about some of the recent thoughts on radiation-induced cancer risk. So over to you, Jackie.
Thank you, Mike. So I am sharing just a couple of slides for everyone. I wanted to just talk to people about a recent review that's being requested by NASA headquarters. And this is to understand the radiation safety standards that need to be abided by, as Mike alluded to in his intro, that an astronaut needs to abide by in order to fly. So it's necessary for NASA to continually review these and refine them over time. And I believe it's been close to a decade, if not a little longer, since the last time they've been reviewed. And so to that end, headquarters, OCHMO, has tasked several NASA teams with looking at several different aspects of the current radiation standards and the outcomes that may go with it, and then also make some recommendations regarding those. So one of those teams is the Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health, of which I am the Senior Epidemiologist for. We also call it LSAH because at NASA we do have to acronymize everything. So we are the Occupational Surveillance Group for the Astronaut Corps, and we've been specifically tasked in this radiation review with reviewing our current data with regard to radiation-induced disease. And so while cancer comes to mind automatically for people when you think about radiation-induced disease, we've actually broadened that definition to include diseases that the Veterans Affairs Administration recognizes as being related to exposures to ionizing radiation. So this list now includes not just all cancers, including non-melanoma skin cancer, but also non-malignant thyroid, nodular disease, parathyroid adenoma, posterior subcapsular cataracts, tumors of the brain and central nervous system, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or AML, as well as diseases of the cardiovascular system. So each of these conditions have different latency periods, preventive screening tools, diagnoses, treatments and prognoses, and each advancement in the practice of medical care has changed the disease characterization across time. As a result, the understanding of the overall picture of these diseases in astronauts requires that we need to evaluate each of these diseases independently. Let's see if I can drop that. So we've broken our task from headquarters into several parts. One of the parts that I just mentioned a minute ago was to look at the prevalence of disease among the astronauts. And so I have a slide here, and this data was published in the LSAH newsletter in 2019. That newsletter goes out to active and former astronauts, as well as some friends of LSAH. And so this is a roll-up of the cancer cases that had been diagnosed as of the end of 2017. And so while the number of 238 could be slightly concerning to look at first, you'll note that the majority of the cases are non-melanoma skin cancer cases. And we worry about non-melanoma skin cancer, not because it's lethal, but because it can be disfiguring. It's also a risk factor for the more serious melanoma skin cancer. So we work on updating the prevalence of these cases on an annual basis. And so one of the other pieces I wanted to talk about were the fact that we don't see the typical cancers that you see in the US general population. You're seeing more, or you're seeing less lung cancer, which is the leading cause of death amongst men and women due to cancer in the United States. And we've also had some rare cases, such as gallbladder, such as nasopharyngeal. So it is a little bit different when you look to try and compare these to the general population. So the second task that we are working on for this radiation standards review is with the Space Radiation Analysis Group, or SRAG as we commonly refer to it. And they're doing a probability of causation analysis. And this analysis is based on NIOSH guidance for calculating the likelihood of a particular cancer that could have been the result of a radiation exposure, such as what an astronaut might get on the way to or on their spaceflight mission. So on the screen now, I've included an example of a probability of causation graph, and these are from the NIOSH website. So the epidemiologist for SRAG actually calculates this with data that is provided by LSAH. And so the inputs for the model for these include the type of cancer, the age at diagnosis of the cancer, mission information, radiation information from the mission, as well as age at the radiation exposure. So because this analysis is based on established radiation related cancer risk models, only the types of cancer for which there is a model can be used for this type of analysis. So here on the screen, I have the all digestive cancers. So on the x-axis for each of these are the doses that may have been received by that particular organ. And then on the y-axis, we have the probability of causation at the 99th within the 99th percentile. And so the NIOSH says that at the 50%, oops, pardon me, go back. At the 50th percentile is where they say that this cancer is probably caused by the radiation exposure. And so as you see on the left-hand side, it does differ by the age of diagnosis. So as a person ages, the probability that the cancer is caused by radiation is much lower. So I just want to talk about the final task with our radiation standards review. And it is a systematic literature review of the existing scientific terrestrial literature, where we're attempting to compare the astronauts with the general population. So a systematic literature review differs from a typical literature review, as it must systematically consider the entire body of literature in order to answer specific questions, and is based on a predefined protocol with standardized methods for searching the literature, selecting articles, and abstracting the data. And we decided to conduct this systematic review as astronaut medical data has been collected for over 60 years. The first astronauts were selected in 1959, and the practice of medicine, epidemiology, and NASA mission profiles have changed across time as well. It's also important to note that the astronaut's active career is only a small percentage of their life. You see here on the screen, as Dr. Barrett said, the career of an astronaut begins when they're selected, but we do attempt to collect data on their pre-NASA exposures, perhaps their military career, perhaps their scientific career. They typically spend about 2 years in ASCAM training, and then spend about 10 to 15 years as an active astronaut. So it definitely is a small percentage of their life. And so, as Mike said, we definitely want to follow them into retirement as we try to understand this unique exposure and how it affects their aging, how it affects their disease risk across time. So with that, I will send it back to Mike.
Thanks very much. That definitely leads to some questions that we'll have. One thing that makes me wonder right off the bat is how the new commercial world, the new astronauts in the commercial enterprises, how much they will actually resemble the general public, which we like to think of neatly as one big massive comparative population. but likely they will be passing through filters as well. So we'll stay tuned on that, and I think we'll be asking you about that.
Great, thanks.
But thank you. I see that Dr. Bill Carpentier has joined us and has overcome the technical world. And we would like to go next to Bill. Bill, you can unmute your microphone and show yourself. Hopefully your camera is enabled. And if you can give us a quick comm check, we will proceed.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
You are. You sound great. Okay, so Bill, I'm going to introduce you. I know that you kind of go for short introductions. I just have to say, Bill is probably considered the flight surgeon emeritus of the Gemini and Apollo programs, and I won't belabor things too much, but Bill is, of course, known for jumping into the ocean out of fast-flying helicopters well above anybody's safe jump altitude, and just had a very storied career during this time period. But more importantly, Bill has been a very keen observer of crew members during this formative time. And I think it was mentioned how, I believe Dr. Schmidt mentioned the value of the naturalist. And Bill has been anything if not a naturalist with a notebook, and really has great insight into what people look like when they return from lunar type missions. Now, as I mentioned, that experience base for us is decades old. And very scant, but this is the guy who probably understands that better than anyone. We have dropped exactly one crew of 2 in the ocean since 1975, and we just did it, and we landed them on a glassy, smooth Gulf of Mexico, and that's all the experience base we have. Bill has much more with that. So I've asked Bill to talk to us a little bit about collecting health metrics during the Gemini and Apollo era, and basically what these crew members will look like. So Dr. Carpentier, over to you.
Okay, am I on?
We hear you well, and not sure that your camera is enabled.
Okay, I'm sorry.
But there you are.
Oh, okay. I apologize for being so late tuning in here, but I had some computer problems and I just got them fixed. And I'm sorry, I'm just not very technically oriented here. I apologize.
Timing is perfect.
Okay, but as Mike said, I was an operational flight surgeon during the Gemini and the Apollo programs, and I worked on multiple flights on both programs, and I was invited back as a consultant periodically during the shuttle program. Now, from Mercury through Apollo, pre-flight and post-flight medical exams were collected on 34 individual astronauts. 19 flew 1 mission and 15 flew 2 to 4 missions, for a total of 59 manned missions for all 3 programs. So it was pointed out in a document called Theseus, published by the European Space Agency in 2012, that we have been collecting data on space medicine for over a half a century, and it has never been put together or integrated. And so my current project is to try to start to remedy that situation. And I have been able to collect almost all of the medical data from the first decade of manned spaceflight, that is from Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. And I am compiling a comprehensive database that I think will be completed shortly. And I have managed to get consent from all the astronauts involved to publish their data, and I'm hoping to publish this database with a preliminary analysis of all 3 programs, hopefully within the next 6 to 8 months. Awesome. Now, there were some common findings, post-flight findings, noted in all of these 3 programs. And these included decreased orthostatic tolerance, decreased exercise capacity, and a decrease in blood volume. Now, these 3 factors were highly correlated with each other. And all 3 were correlated with weight loss, and weight loss was correlated with caloric intake. So for all of the orthostatic tolerance and exercise capacity tests, the higher the oxygen consumption in the exercise tests, the lower the heart rates were during the orthostatic tests. Also, post-flight measurements were found to be highly correlated with the pre-flight measurements. And so, all things being equal, the better the astronaut better shape the astronaut was in pre-flight, the better he was in shape, better shape he was in post-flight. Now, in addition to the Gemini tilt table tests and the Apollo LBNP tests and stand tests, I was able to look at the pre-flight and post-flight heart rate data from the 9 Skylab LBNP tests, 11 shuttle stand tests, and 6 Neurolab tilt tests. And the post-flight increases in heart rate shown in these programs were in the same range as were documented during Apollo. So in all programs, higher post-flight heart rates were associated with greater weight loss. Now, there was a publication summarizing LVNP and stand tests results on 7 shuttle flights lasting from 6 to 14 days that I was able to review. Now, the crewmen, it was pointed out, the crewmen that had pre-syncopal symptoms and were not able to complete these tests were compared to the group that did not have any pre-syncopal symptoms. Now, in both groups, the post-flight supine rest, the LBNP, and stand heart rates were significantly correlated with the pre-flight rates. And the crewmen that had no pre-syncopal symptoms had pre-flight standing LBNP heart rates or standing heart rates of 75 beats per minute or less, and a post-flight maximum heart rate of 105 beats per minute or less. So that is the group that I would want to be in. Now, my preliminary analysis of the Gemini and the Apollo data suggests that 85 to 90% of the post-flight cardiovascular changes that were documented appear to be predictable. So for the tilt table tests, post-flight heart rate is predictable within a few beats per minute from the pre-flight resting heart rate, the average rate of decrease in plasma volume per day, and the duration. And this model works just as well if calories per day per kilogram intake is substituted for plasma volume loss per day, because these two factors are also highly related. Now, the same equations work for predicting post-flight heart rates from the shuttle and the Apollo stand tests. And the post-flight heart rates for the LBNP tests were more variable, but they are still highly predictable. So if anybody here is going to go on a short-term space flight, I would suggest that you do 2 things. The first thing is to get into good shape pre-flight. The better shape you are in pre-flight, the better you will be able to accomplish the in-flight tasks, and the better shape you will be in post-flight. And I think that the goal to work toward appears to be an oxygen consumption of 30 to 35 cc's per kilogram at a heart rate of 160. And this should be associated with a resting supine heart rate of less than 60 and a pre-flight standing heart rate of less than 75 beats per minute. Secondly, have an adequate intake of nutrients, water, and electrolytes in flight that will help prevent weight loss and then therefore blood volume loss. And this looks like it would require 30 to 35 kilocalories per kilogram of body weight per day on an Apollo type diet and about 30 cc's of water per day. So if these 2 pieces of advice were followed, I believe that there would be an extremely low probability of developing any significant post-flight symptoms of cardiovascular deconditioning.
Okay, appreciate that, Bill. I will have a follow-on question when we open it up. I always like studies that point towards eating better and well, so that's a good thing. But it's interesting to me that across Apollo, Skylab, and Shuttle, we had very similar findings, which suggested some of the adjuncts that came with Shuttle didn't necessarily help that much, such as our rigorous fluid loading protocol and the in-flight shuttle exercise. But very interesting observation then. I'd like to move to Dr. Sergei Wacker. Dr. Wacker is a flight surgeon who works actually for KBR Wiley in Germany. He provides space medical support to the European Space Agency and has supported several ESA long-duration missions in various functions and capacities. He is now working on the development of a new medical database that will allow ESA to perform longitudinal crew health assessments. Sergei is also the point of contact for personal medical data protection for the space medical team at the European Space Agency and a co-author of the ESA Astronaut Medical Data Management Policy. So well-versed in some of the things that are part and parcel to lifetime surveillance. And he'll be discussing today some of the personal data protection at ESA and a little bit about their new medical database for longitudinal health assessments. So over to you. Sergey, I think you're still muted. I've actually, there we go. Stand by. Try again here. We might need an audio reconfig there.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Now
Brilliant.
better? My apologies. I was running out of battery and then I connected and it made a glitch here. So I was saying that I was listening to the previous speakers. Thank you very much, first of all. I was listening to, for instance, Rebecca read how difficult it was to put the policy in the situation of the US government. You need to imagine that we are 20 countries at ESA. Each one of them before 2018 had a different way of managing personal data, private medical data specifically. So the European Union actually launched a framework to actually put all this together, the personal data protection, the general personal data protection rules. But the problem is ESA is not bound just to the European Union because it has countries that are not from the European Union. So ESA had to do the same. So I'm saying all this because now, since 1.5 years, we have a data protection regulation within ESA that allows us to understand well what we can and we cannot do. So the long-term surveillance of our astronauts, the use of data to make the studies that you just presented, for instance, with the radiation, will fall on the research domain. And that's very important to say. It has to go with the data protection plan, a data sharing plan, and an approval from medical board, an ethics board, and the approval of the astronaut. I think it makes all sense, but now it's regulated, and I think it's beautifully put down. Now, this allows for longitudinal studies, but from the surgeon perspective, which is what I would like to bring to you today, we have decoupled from that. We have allegedly said, from the surgeon side, we're going to focus on supporting the mission. We're going to focus on knowing the best we can how you guys are doing, meaning our astronauts, putting you at the best shape for the mission and during the mission and after the mission. But we're not going to go engage into research. And that's important to say. That's actually seconded by astronaut groups. We have decided this together because the surgeon, we believe, needs to be focused and not biased when doing medicine for the crew members. That doesn't mean that I'm not interested in that. It's just that it's going to be passed through different procedures to researchers. Now, on the other side, we do want to provide the best medical care. And for that, we have engaged into the establishment of an advanced database that is not just a warehouse. It's a database that automatically gives you a representation of how the data of your astronaut is evolving through the years and throughout the same mission, actually. And actually, it allows you to compare to the previous mission as you're using it without the need to actually make some calculations as you go. So you don't need to export it and use it somewhere else. You can have it right there to actually see trends, see changes. And of course, I mean, I must say our astronauts are the best of the world, actually. There's nowhere else that can be as good as these astronauts. It's because we are excellent doctors and we take care of them perfectly, of course. No, that's farthest from reality now, on the surgeon side, of course. No, but our astronauts are certified for flight. They are ready. They have the best standards we can meet. But we're talking here about making it even better. You can see trends. You can see changes that you can anticipate. Then, for instance, adapt training, adapt nutrition recommendation, etc., that actually put them at an even better and more competitive level. So we're not talking about pathology. We're talking about proactively enhance health. And that you can see throughout the different missions and even inside the same mission if you have such a system. So we are starting, we have that starting to function now. We're trying to now refine the process. And I can give you an example. And I was listening to Bill Carpenter and I loved the associations you sir found because surprisingly, we've been able, for instance, now to see associations on ways of doing exercise and retention on VO2 max and post-landing outputs. So with this longitudinal assessment within a mission and after taking several missions of the same astronaut, you can see what exercise is better for your astronaut. So what type? I'm talking about, is it about numbers of repetitions? It is about the strength you're putting on ARED, for instance. It is about the speed you put on the CVs. It is about of the clips you put on the CVs also on the loads you exert. which is very nice. This is not for publishing. This is for just us understanding what is the best way to provide the best medicine for our crew members. So this is one of the functionalities we're now having with database, which are very, very neat from our perspective. So then another topic that we have been using the database for is on the analysis of the multiple flyers. So, you know, we have not a long history of long duration missions, but we do have quite a bit in total of a number of flights. I think we are now on the, sorry, I made a mistake now, but around the 70 flights, human flights that we have done at ISTA. And we have several repeaters, so 7 second flyers and even third flyers. And that's something I would like to throw to the community, because we have seen something very interesting, which is that when you have the average of your astronaut crew and you plot your astronaut, the one that it's doing the first mission, you may be oriented, okay, you expect that in this population you lose 5% of XYZ, okay, or you gain so much weight, or you lose so much weight, etc., or you drop hemoglobin, etc., or bone mineral density. And now you can use that to guide your therapy and expect what will happen. But if you take that same astronaut and you analyze the second mission, and if that person flies the third mission and then you plot it, surprisingly, they follow themselves. They follow the same changes. So now a new avenue is starting to be conceived, which is, can we actually make, using this longitudinal assessment of how did you perform on previous missions, to actually improve what we're doing. So if we combine things like, we know what exercise is best for you to keep the VO2 max, and we expect you to lose this same VO2 max that you lost in the previous mission, we may be able to tailor your exercise in flight and even pre-flight to actually make a tailor-made medicine for you, for just that crew member. And that's something we're exploring. We see this with short duration missions. I hope we can see now with repeated flyers on our crew members. And I mean, our program is not as big as you guys have. We are not as ambitious, but I think we're doing certain steps forward that we'll see develop in the next years that I'm very excited to see, actually. And that would be it from my side. I know was not as extensive like the others, but I'm sorry. And I can take any questions you can have. Thank you.
Yeah, that was perfect. So very succinct, and again, we'll hopefully have some time for questions as we get through the other speakers. But everything we do from a bureaucratic standpoint, I know is magnified at least a power of 10 for you guys. So really appreciate your efforts. Next, Dr. Mary Van Balen. Dr. Van Balen, also known as Dr. LSAH. She is an occupational epidemiologist, and she serves as the NASA lead to the Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health and Life Sciences Data Archive. Mary and her teams are charged with curating the medical and research data, analyzing that data, and providing data expertise for NASA and the international space community use. We actually work these guys very hard trying to answer questions that are longstanding and those that pop up periodically. And she'll be talking to us about data commonality issues across partners and programs. So over to you, Dr. Van Balen.
Okay, because I'm a data person and I need some pictures to show the data, I'm going to use, like Jackie, some screens. So bear with me as I show these. Can you guys see those, Mike?
Yes, data commonality challenges.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce first the archives themselves and give you a sense, and the audience a sense of the 2 different archives that you introduced me to be part of. The Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health data repository is the medical data repository. It's important to note that it's all medical data contained in space medicine records from selection through annual exams and on into retirement. So when we think about those, we're going to think about that as past and then all future data that is collected. It may include medically relevant information, so it's going to have hazard exposures. You mentioned CO2 exposures. It'll have training exposures and other records that are pertinent to occupational health. Conversely, the LSDA is the research data repository, and it's an active archive of all of the research data that NASA's conducted since 1961 and on through to current analog missions, as well as ISS, shuttle, et cetera. It is past data. It was data that was collected in the past. The thing that I think is interesting is if we look at the structure of this data, LSAH is an aggregation of measures and many measures across an individual over time, and that is the structure of that data set. whereas the research data tends to be from individual studies that are archived as an aggregation of certain measures across several individuals to test a hypothesis. Very importantly, the research data archives can also be containing medical or clinical measures. And so my favorite measure to talk about is blood pressure. Blood pressure will be used to assess the health through an LSAH repository data, but there also will be blood pressures from the research studies. And often we can combine those data across the archives and compile data sets that can be very valuable for longitudinal assessments around different missions. And we can compare across the different programs and so forth. But that data compilation comes with a lot of challenges. This slide depicts several types of data that are collected for SANS. I think SANS has been discussed in several different forums here and briefly mentioned in today's session. You can see the need for transformation of this data from paper records, medical images, electronic data that are queryable and non-queryable. And this gets further complicated across individuals, across our international partners, across medical providers, across time because medicine has changed. And then if we want to combine research data across the research studies as well. So when we go to combine data sets across all of these formats, right, there's a reconciliation of records that have to occur. There's some need to look at all of the different formatting differences, the resolution and result of hardware and software incompatibilities. What do you do when data were missing because they're not in one record, but they're in another record? Correct errors, and then ultimately, as Sergey mentioned, again, mask identifiers, because even within the United States, although our privacy requirements are different, we have privacy and the need to protect the privacy of our astronauts. I'm going to use SANS data as an example to illustrate some of these compilation issues. But NASA has looked into many solutions. We have done data system upgrades, and we've looked at new data science tools, and we are doing that across both of our archives. The LSAH platform, the medical data repository that's being built to house medical and exposure data, is called Impala. And many of these audience may have heard presentations on the Impala platform. This has been invested in and been worked on over the last several years. The LSDA, the research data repository, the platform is just starting to be built to house the research data, is going to be using the Insight tool. And again, the differences in the structure of the data will be addressed, and we'll have workspaces where we can look to combine the data parameters to do robust data analyses. Collaborations with our international partners is vital, and so I like hearing what Sergey had to say. I'm going to be using SANS as a risk, and so we have a SANS working group that's been produced. The SANS medical community sought to capture common medical information starting back in 2010. The group that's pictured here was assembled to start analyzing this data. Mike was one of the individuals that helped me work with an international partner collaboration so that we could start analyzing this data. And by doing so, we increase our N significantly. However, all of the challenges that I showed you in that last slide show all of the different data formats that must be addressed in this. So my final kind of take-home point on all of these data commonality challenges is to look at optical coherence tomography as an example to illustrate the effort that the SANS working group has undertaken. If we start up at the left and we look at the data acquisition and we look across the International Space Station program, we can see that the Zeiss optical OCT device was used in one time frame, and the Heidelberg Engineering OCT device was used in a second time frame. So those data are collected via proprietary software. That proprietary software produces some sort of a report that's necessary for clinical care output. And so the clinical care output are the reports here with a clinical interpretation that get addressed into a medical record. As Sergey pointed out, we can look across how an individual does in their multiple missions across these different reports. We can look at across the groups of individuals that have flown and make recommendations for how to better improve clinical care. And that has resulted in data collection paradigms that have changed across the ISS program. As we've gotten smarter, we do different testing. And so now there's a comprehensive testing suite that is done on ISS. However, often the diagnosis is insufficient to answer questions. And so we have to look at how to get an understanding of measures that will let us look at mechanisms or risk factors. And so what we then have to do is look into that proprietary software and transform, not from the report, but the actual data fields behind those graphs that you see to create a comprehensive data set for research questions. And so what I am showing here on the right side of my slide is the need for custom code to extract those measures, to come up with interpretations so that those can be analyzed. I really want to shout out to the international partners that have worked with us on doing this over the last several years so that we can look at detailed measures on an ocular fashion, say retinal nerve fiber layer or total retinal thickness, in a way that can be robust to augment our understanding what's occurring in the space medicine community. I use this as an example, but every clinical entity has something very similar like this. And it is important to consider that in our archives as we approach this. And I want to underscore the importance of solving these data commonality issues. And essentially, Mike, that's all I had. And so I'll send it back to you.
Okay, that's brilliant then. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to move us right along. And for sake of time, we don't really have an end time, but we're not going to go forever. So we'll get through our next two panelists. And I would like to propose keeping the question channel open until 1 o'clock. That'll give us an hour and 15 minutes total panel, and hopefully get a chance to get some of the questions out. So I'd like to move to Dr. Susan Bloomfield. Dr. Bloomfield is a research professor in health and kinesiology at the Texas A&M University. Much of her research career is focused on spaceflight-induced bone loss. However, her broader experience with the human biomedical challenges for long-duration missions and her service on the National Academy of Sciences CAMI group, for those not familiar with that, that's the Committee on Aerospace Medicine and the Medicine of Extreme Environments. That's made her a very passionate advocate for preserving biomedical data from active and retired astronauts. So she'll be updating us today on the Texas A&M's RADAR project, which is looking at the feasibility of a health data repository for international retired astronauts and cosmonauts. So over to you, Dr. Bloomfield.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm thankful for the opportunity to update everybody on our project. This year, of all years, has certainly appreciated our appreciation of the pivotal role that epidemiologists play in contributing to human health here on Earth. These scientists take reams and reams of data and apply their sophisticated analyses to generate important clues to, this year, COVID-19 transmission routes, risk factors affecting medical outcomes, and so on. Well, to our topic today, those working hard in all our space agencies to protect human health during or after space missions rarely have the luxury of reams of data. On the contrary, subject number for most reported studies rarely exceeds 7 or 8 per group. But NASA recognized early on the value that epidemiology is applied to protecting astronaut health might provide by establishing what we now know as the Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health Unit. Determining the long-term health effects of time spent in the space environment is highly pertinent now, given the recent implementation of the TREAT Act by the US Congress that we've heard about earlier. The only way to really approach an answer to this question is to accumulate enough data, allowing for statistically powered analyses, and importantly, to carefully select a comparator population that remains here on Earth. So increasing the number of individuals in such a database is especially critical in light of the many lifestyle and genetic factors that contribute to chronic conditions like cancer and cardiovascular disease. So the medical data of every single crew member we send into space should be considered a precious national and international resource that, when pooled in aggregate with data from hundreds of others, could provide the critical information to direct our priorities and countermeasure research in the short term. So in support of this goal, our team at Texas A&M has been working towards the ultimate goal of systematic collection of biomedical data from over the long term from retired international crew to supplement the data currently being collected very competently by the LSAH team. So for me, I'm going to share a few slides and give everybody an update on this project. So you can see our purpose reiterated above. What's real important is that we look at we have some limitations currently, and some of them are just logistical. I mean, it's a very complex task to transmit medical data from many disparate sources, physicians, hospitals, laboratory reports, and so forth. And you saw an illustration of that from Mary Van Valen in the very many different formats of data that they have to deal with. Currently, also LSAH is by mandate collecting only from American and Canadian retired crew after their active service. We also have a time challenge. As you can see in the graph below, a histogram of the surviving astronauts, and this is just for the American program. 28% of surviving crew members are 70 years of age or older. So we have a closing window to collect data from some of these important former crew members. So what we've been doing in a one-year feasibility study funded by Trish is to first gather input from retired crew and stakeholders. We distributed some surveys to those groups at this meeting last year when we were all together in person at the Baker Institute, and also to retired crew from many countries attending the Association of Space Explorers meeting in Houston. We've also had some interviews and very helpful talks with LSAH managers and several in flight medicine. And that's all provided us very useful input moving forward. We'll report on that in more detail at the Human Research Program workshop coming up early February. Our second major task was to define a minimally viable product for increased ease and efficiency of medical data collection and transfer for any one retired crew member. So with our industry consultant, Be Prescient, we developed a product requirement document, a very extensive document, defining what we were looking for in that product. We then performed some due diligence, surveying the landscape of current personal health record platforms, looked at 7 different candidates and ended up selecting one called MyFHR from a company named Care Evolution. And that application is currently in testing with some convenient sample of volunteer US retired crew. We would have loved to test it with international crew, but we couldn't afford the time delay in overcoming international medical privacy law restrictions that we might run into. So some of the challenges we've identified are that indeed there are some logistical challenges for retired crew in collecting their data from medical sources that are run in the up to 10 or more. There are also cultural, health policy, and legal obstacles in different countries to above. And one of our team members, Kason Schmidt, our expert in medical privacy law, has been working on a preliminary survey of some of those obstacles, surveying laws in Russia, Japan, China, India, and Canada, as well as in the EU, where the General Data Protection Regulation exists that Sergey mentioned earlier, and is then looking at whether in each of those cases, does the local law create a right for the individual, the retired crew member, to access their personal health information? And then secondly, if there's any restriction on transmission of that data by that individual crew member. So is there anything in the law preventing that? And lastly, would a future data commons, data repository be subject to those countries' medical privacy law protection requirements? So we've got some good preliminary information on this account. Lastly, we figured that we need to determine the appropriate data governing body and the best data commons model for such as a data repository for collecting such data. And Sergey's talk also reminds me that we really need to hear from and communicate with others in the other space agencies about their current efforts. But to the best of our knowledge and discussions with dozens of retired crew from many countries, they're not aware of a systematic collection of their data over many decades. So our next steps with this project are to use our findings from this feasibility phase to further develop and validate the technology for medical data transfer. Secondly, a much deeper dive into the cultural or health policy and legal challenges across multiple countries to collecting such data and to develop some proposed solutions. And lastly, we need to work with appropriate international partners, perhaps some multilateral control boards that are already established, and NASA's LSAH on requirement definitions for a data governing body and the optimal data commons model that might be used. So here I just list our radar team and our consultants. Very happy to have John Charles with us and Trish's advisor. Grateful for funding from Trish for this feasibility study and some funds from our Texas A&M President's Excellence Fund. And if any of you listening are retired US astronauts and would like to participate in our current evaluation of this personal health record tool, please do contact Bonnie Dunbar as soon as possible, and you see her email there. All right, so thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, thanks very much, Dr. Bloomfield. As you can see, this topic of lifetime surveillance is really all over the map. We're going to get on to the next speaker, who's going to take us to another data point where we haven't actually dropped a pin yet on this map. For everything that presents what we would call a new opportunity in spaceflight, those that have to realize that opportunity realize that it's going to be hard, and we've asked Mr. Bradley Rhodes to do something hard. Brad is the Assistant Director in the Human Health and Performance Directorate at JSC. He's very well known to the space medical community for many years. He has a diverse background experience, including mission operations in the Space Shuttle program, manager within the Human Research Program, Deputy Division Chief for Space Medicine, and manager of the Human Exploration Operations Crew Health and Safety Program. And most recently, he has been charged to launch the commercialization office for the Human Health and Performance Directorate. Now, he's going to be wrapping up our CAN presentations by discussing the possible opportunity and the potential challenges of collecting meaningful health data from the upcoming private astronaut missions. Now, Brad, just because I know how capable you are, I'm going to let you start, but I'm going to give you a feeler question that came in, and just going to out him. This is from Anil Menon, who's the Chief Medical Officer for SpaceX. And I'm just going to pick one of his questions, which is, if a commercial company does have private health data, what is the best pathway to share that data with researchers? So as you talk about the challenges with there, just maybe understand that the commercial community is already reaching out to us, trying to figure out how best to make this data, which we all agree is mutually valuable, fit into a framework that's meaningful. So on to you, Mr. Rhodes.
Can you see me, Mike?
Not just yet, but there's usually a little bit of a delay. You're coming in loud and clear. There you are. Brilliant.
Okay, I'll go ahead and get started anyway. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about private astronauts. Up front, when I talk about private astronauts, oftentimes I'll talk about private astronaut missions. So sometimes I'll default and I'll use the acronym PAM as we have these discussions here today. A little bit of background to kind of get everybody on the same page is that back in 2019, NASA had updated its NRA that was focused on expanding the commercialization of low Earth orbit. And the real principal new initiative that came with this update was it was going to allow the International Space Station to now be a destination for these private astronaut missions. It had promise, or at least hopes, that would offer up to 2 flights each and every year to accommodate these private astronaut missions. It could accommodate up to 4 private astronauts on each one of these flights. It would also allow for them to be able to dock to the International Space Station for durations up to 30 days, in which they could conduct their own scientific, commercial, or other private activities while they are there. For purposes of this panel, what's interesting about this is we now have 8 more humans that are going to be launching every year that might be able to give us some insight to learn how the humans adapt to the stressors of space flight. I'll talk a little bit about the data that we know that we're going to get on these private astronauts. Right now, as we talk, there is a directive that's in the hallowed halls of headquarters right now going through the review cycle, and it's going to establish what the pre-flight screening criteria and the medical evaluation testing are going to be for each of these private astronauts. There was a lot of deliberation and a lot of consideration that was given in helping establish what these requirements were going to be. And ultimately it was decided that was in everybody's best interest is that these private astronauts are going to be held to the same standard and the same testing regimen as our government astronauts are, and as it's defined in our Med Volume A, which is our certification for flight standards. I'm going to pause for just a minute and point something really, really critical out about this. Is NASA is not going to be certifying these private astronauts for flight. Instead, what's going to happen is that these packages are going to be brought forth by the providers, such as Dr. Menon that you mentioned. They're going to be reviewed at our Astronaut Medical Board. They're going to be reviewed by the agency's Chief Health and Medical Officer. And they're also going to be provided to the MSMB chair for review as well. What they're going to review it for is to look for any health conditions that any of these private astronauts may have, along with any proposed associated mitigations, and determine if there's a residual risk as a result of that, those health conditions to either our astronauts or to our government missions. It's important to point that out. And the other thing that's important to point out is even though the Med-As are fairly comprehensive, they touch on just about every body system there is that you're collecting data on, they are limited to pre-flight only. They do not have an in-flight nor a post-flight component that's being levied on the private astronauts, with the exception is it does require that they have at least weekly PMCs with their crew members while they're aboard the ISS. So the question comes in, given this amount of data, how can this potentially help us understand the long-term or even short-term health challenges to our astronauts? And I reached out to Dr. Van Balen before coming here and talked a little bit about the lessons learned and the potential limitations from our original LSAH. And by that, I'm referring back to the longitudinal study of astronaut health. And as a reminder, that design actually used the fairly healthy JSC workforce as a comparative cohort for this study. And the participation by that workforce was also, it was pretty good. However, when it came time to review the data from the study itself, there were some shortcomings that were noted about using this particular cohort as being comparable to the astronaut population. One of the factors that was noted is that not having a comprehensive medical history, nor having some exhaustive long-term follow-up data on the JSC workforce was a limitation. The second one was, and this is probably going to come as no surprise, but our astronauts are highly screened, they are highly conditioned, and they're routinely monitored for their health status. And given all of that, again, just that health status itself didn't make them really comparable to the JSC workforce. And those were failings that were not only noted by Mary, but they were also documented later by the IOM as well. Just, how healthy is our workforce? We just typically, we have to understand is that our average crew member flies at about an age of about 43 years old. About 70% of them have previous or ongoing military experience, as well as the conditioning that's involved with being in the military. And I mean, just generally speaking, they're very healthy with very little to no comorbidities associated with them. So what can we think we're going to see with the private astronauts? I think that we can probably guess they're going to be even less homogeneous in their makeup than what the JSC workforce was. Likely going to be less data rich, both in their medical history, as well as to be able to get the long-term follow-up data on these private astronauts. And again, I don't think it's too far stretched to say that they're going to be likely less conditioned than our government astronauts. Those are just facts. Those are just the way it lays out. I don't want to diminish the opportunities for getting valuable insight from these private astronauts, but it really does bring up the question, kind of what Anil is asking again, is who's going to do this and how we might best use this data. So I did reach out to the human research program and spoke a little bit with Dr. Fogarty about some opportunities in her realm for this. And I'll say right now they're kind of in the fact-finding mode to see how they might be able to use this data. A real benefit is if they would come up with a full research initiative, is that part of that they could include not only those pre-flight health assessments, but they could get in-flight measures as well as follow-up post-flight as well, which I think everybody here on the panel would recognize as being an absolute necessity. Jen thought that perhaps that they could use this data, one, to be able to build confidence in their analog models. HRP has a long and successful history of being able to recruit private citizens for participation in their analog studies, and it might give them a really unique opportunity to be able to fly these private citizens now up to the International Space Station. And with those data points, it could prove valuable to be able to take our ground knowledge and to predict how it would inform it better, how it would translate to flight. Another way is that right now, most of our astronauts that are going to the International Space Station are there almost exclusively for long duration missions. Having multiple crew members each and every year going to the International Space Station for short duration flights of varying length could help fill in some gaps in our knowledge about the time course of some space health issues. SANS has been mentioned more than once, and that would be an ideal one to be able to investigate. And lastly, is if HRP would do this in a systematic collection of this data and analysis of the data, ultimately it really could yield some disease management or some new risk management strategies that would be more relatable to a wider cadre of human beings. And those are going to be the ones that we're most likely going to see in these future commercial endeavors. There are some limitations with this. Right now, HRP, I mean, they're being driven and their efforts are really focused on exploration initiatives right now. So it kind of brings into question, do we have an agency imperative to go off and do this? Or do we even have clear authorization right now to be able to go off and collect and analyze these private astronauts' data, really to be able to share with these future commercialization initiatives? One of the questions I had is if the decision is the agency is not going to do that right now, or it's going to be delayed in doing it, is clearly it's a gap and it's an opportunity that we need to find some way in order to be able to fill. So I had just a couple of suggestions or a couple of thoughts for this audience to maybe think about. And I wonder if maybe the Private Astronaut Coalition itself might not recognize the value of having this knowledge in order to be able to benefit their own future growth. Secondarily, similarly what we see with big pharma or what we see with precision medicine, does this create opportunities with medical data management expertise companies to go off and invest in harvesting this data for its own commercial purposes? And then lastly, even though there's a moratorium on regulatory agencies right now putting additional restrictions on after the capsule reaches orbit, ultimately, would this data be of value to, say, either the FAA or even OSHA as we go forward into the future and establish these new occupations in space? And, I'll just close in saying is that this is no longer in the future. This private astronaut era is upon us, and it's with everything else, it offers both new opportunities and new challenges and questions that we have to go off and resolve. With that, I'll say thanks.
All right, thanks very much, Brad. It is 12:59. I do have a couple of questions I'd like to get out there based on some of the questions we've gotten. And just because we probably won't have a group like this assembled again for a long, long time. So until the Baker Institute cuts us off. But I think this is messaging that's extremely critical to the community, the commercial and the retired astronaut community out there. So I really appreciate the panel's inputs. We have had a couple of folks had to drop off, Dr. Reed and Dr. Van Balen, but a couple of things to throw out. It boggles the mind that even a commercial enterprise would consider flying a crew member without in-flight or post-flight, knowing what we know of space medicine, knowing that even flights of a few weeks duration, you might see signs of SANS. I think that it's probably not so much a cavalier attitude, meaning go fly and good luck with that, is probably not being informed adequately. And so there needs to be a messaging effort to all of the commercial enterprises out there that really tells people why we do, what we see, and how that might apply to their programs. And again, if the commercial program, whatever enterprise, reaches out to us meaning the community, which could be NASA, ESA, or the Radar Project, are we ready to include them somehow into our data collection? And Brad, you did touch on some strategies for that.
The one point that I might make in response to that, Mike, because I think that's a very astute observation, is that when I was talking about that the only requirement that they had right now is for this pre-flight testing and screening, those are the requirements that are levied by the agency. What we decided to do was leave it up to these private astronaut providers to decide with our input. They always have access to our knowledge base and our expertise on what we recommend that they would do with their crew members. But the requirement is only for this pre-flight screening.
And it is absolutely their discretion to do or to not do, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Let me throw one other question out there. If in the course of analysis, whether it be within our LSAH or within the European system data analysis or within a program such as the TAMU Radar Project, we find something that is of concern that would prompt action, either different surveillance for the long-term studies that are finding these things, or even real-time monitoring during that flight career. Do we have a mechanism for breaking the seal, understanding that there's privacy issues and potentially proprietary issues in the commercial world? Are we ready to break the seal and inform the community of stakeholders of this finding, and have we given that some thought? Let me start with Sergi, if I could.
Oh, thank you, Mike, for the question. It's not an easy question. We do have an advantage here because we have separated completely what is science and what is operations. If I was to find a trend on an astronaut that is pathological, I would talk to the astronaut. I would take internal actions to treat or prevent or control that pathology, that problem, without having to inform the community. And that will keep the privacy contained within our medical support as a relation of a patient and a doctor. Now, if we want to inform the community to actually engage into research activities, for instance, that's something that has already happened. For instance, DVT issues that have been published in the New England Journal of Medicine, that happened, and that has triggered, for instance, on the ESA side, the generation of a topical team instructed to actually develop a roadmap on actually finding solutions for that. So I think the communication can be there without actually having to break any confidentiality. You can say, this problem has occurred. I don't give you more details on to whom has occurred and attributable data, but this problem has occurred and we need to find a solution. And we have mechanism for that. We may have to actually improve our international approach to that, definitely.
Okay, I appreciate that. I would say that the venous thrombosis was probably the fastest we've ever seen between discovery and publication and airing. And so I think that's a great example. Dr. Bloomfield, same question to you with regard to the Radar Project.
Yes, thanks. I think this is one of our keen hopes, right? Is that with longitudinal surveillance of retired crew, right, where there might be health issues that arise decades later, that we can then translate that to protecting the health of current active crew. And it's going to take as Sergey notes, you don't have to reveal identity of someone to say, oh, we've observed this problem is cropping up. But to identify those problems, we really do need an increased number, right, of data points. And so whatever we can do, that's our chief goal, of course, is whatever we can do to increase that data collection and then make it available to competent peer-reviewed researchers, then to translate that back to better healthcare for current astronauts to protect their in-flight health and performance, but also to protect their health over the decades after they retire.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. Our first and very patient question asker was, and this is more for Jacqueline, how do the rates of the cancers that we see in astronauts compare to the general population? How do they compare to cohorts of astronauts trained but did not fly, which is a very small number? One thing you did mention is that the distribution of cancers we tend to see in astronauts is already different from the general population. And so can we really make a comparison? And I know you touched a little bit about probability of causation, but can you address that?
Sure. So I think that is part of the reason we are conducting the systematic review on each type of cancer and not cancer as a whole. Because when you think of cancer, it is, potentially hundreds of different disease entities and not just a single umbrella term. Because there are so many different risk factors, there are so many different screening procedures, so many different diagnostic procedures and treatments, that each of these need to be studied individually and can't just be lumped together. I think in terms of the rates compared to the general population, the one analysis that we have completed with melanoma finds that the incidence is actually similar to the general population. However, it might have an increased risk of mortality. So some of that may be important. As well, we're looking more deeply into prostate cancer because we are seeing quite a few cases of prostate cancer. However, the U.S. Preventative Service Task Force on the screening of prostate cancer has changed considerably across time, now letting men kind of choose their approach to their screening. So we started screening astronauts at the age of 40, which tends to be at least 10 years younger than the US general population, which may lead to an increased diagnosis of prostate cancer that may have been a slow growth, that may, men tend to get prostate cancer as they age. The joke is that your probability of prostate cancer is equal to your age. So, the prostate cancer may be important to look at. And so that is actually one of the analyses that we're looking at. Lots of, all these different disease entities make it difficult to study cancer.
Right. I understand. And that, of course, is hampered by the fairly small numbers that we deal with.
The ones and twos, right? We have we called it in our database, we called it single cases for a long time because there were so many different single cases that we were looking at.
Right.
Okay. Yes.
And to switch gears a little bit, Dr. Andre Kuipers is online, and this may be more of a Sergey question. Understanding the data privacy rules in different home countries of the astronauts do make it difficult to collect the data. This is also very salient to Dr. Bloomfield's program. However, what he asks is if he as an individual gives his consent that his ESA data can be used, or can he send the medical data himself, do those national legal obstacles still exist? Is that still a hindrance?
So I'll take the question. Thank you for the question, Andre. I was trying to look you at actually the email directory to actually answer to you directly, but I'm going to take the forum. Actually, it's perfect. One clarification, also to Susan Bloomfield. ESA has no jurisdiction in the EU. So if you use GDPR, this is for the EU. The European Union. ESA has its own rules, and they are public, and I can share them with you. So it's good, but they are, to be honest, a copy. not a copy in per se, but adapted to the agency, but they cover the same. And one of the things that it said there as that the subject is the owner of the data. So yes, Andre, if you as a subject want to use your data for whatever reason you want to use it, you are entitled to have it, and we will give it to you. We have to keep a copy for 30 years for legal things, for legal purposes. That's the repository we have to keep. But yes, you are, as a private person, allowed to do anything that you want to do with your data.
Oh, can I chime in, Mike?
Sure.
Yeah, that's great news, because that was one of our working assumptions, was that if we could find a technology that would enable an individual retired crew member to collect his or her own data, and therefore then be in control of that data, it would really, really simplify the process. We didn't want to assume, that all the space agencies and different countries would enable that, excuse me, but that was certainly our intent. So, and this, I want to remind everyone, as Bonnie Dunbar has shared with this group several times, the Association of Space Explorers developed a consensus statement several years ago, and it was a unanimously approved statement that we are more than willing to share our data if it's used responsibly and in support of protecting crew health and performance. So I think there's a huge willingness of retired crew to contribute to this process, and we just have to make it easy and efficient, and of course, according to local legal restrictions. But that's great news.
Just
Thanks.
One additional quick comment on that. What we do have to protect, and we have the responsibility to protect, is the means of transmission, and the data is securely transmitted,
Yes,
and privately,
absolutely.
etc.
Yes.
We cannot just release it because it's our responsibility that it's safely kept.
Yes. Yes.
Yes,
It's
of course.
doing it secure and in a data protected fashion is absolutely essential, and that was clearly part of our product requirement definition. That any product we might be using has to be absolutely secure, because of course no one wants their data widely shared.
And then one clarification, sorry, Mike, very quickly, because I think it's very important for this one. Remember that ESA was founded actually in 1917, 1980 was entry into force. Not all countries belong to ESA at the same time. They have been joining. It can be that certain flights have data on their national agencies that we do not control. So that's still, it's true. You may have to look at that, definitely.
Thank you. Good point.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to just reflect a comment by an anonymous but obviously well-informed attendee, and then ask a question from that. And then with that, I'm going to ask the Baker Institute to give us the hook whenever they want us to stop, because I think this is really useful dialogue and is very vigorous at this moment. It is a truism that the requirements for commercial spaceflight for the ISS program are going to come from the FAA. There are some preliminary agreements that might include a possible long-term database, and this person agrees this is an opportunity for academic and commercial programs to be set up with space agencies as collaborators. One thing that Mary emphasized a little bit, and I will really emphasize more, is that the meaningful collection and analysis of data is very resource intensive. It is costly and labor intensive and requires very specialized expertise. So the question comes up is, who pays for this collaboration? Do we set up a system where the agencies which have the experience base, the infrastructure, and potentially the deeper pocket curate this data? Do we set up an international organization with paid subscribers who have access to the data if they contribute and meet and share information? So just a couple of thoughts on that, and then I'm being told we'll wrap it up after this discussion. But very interested in panel members' thoughts on that. Susan, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. Well, you've raised an excellent point. And thus far, of course, we've been relying on the generosity of Trish to fund the Translational Research Institute for Space Health, which is ultimately funded by NASA, to sponsor this initial feasibility study. Now, I don't think it's fair to rely solely on one agency to fund a large collective effort. And you're right, it is going to be expensive. You need to have skilled personnel, just like LSAH has. You need constant staffing and curating of such an archive. So it's a far more complex task once we started diving into it than we expected. But I think reaching out to international partners, international funding agencies, the international space agencies might be the way to go, because just like the ISS, it might have to be an international effort for it to be successful.
Okay, appreciate it. Brad, do you have any thoughts on that?
Excuse me, yeah, and that was kind of at the end of my discussion I was trying to get at, is that I do think that there's some opportunities for us to come together and to begin to discuss it. And like Sue just said, I do think it's going to take a community in order to be able to make this successful, whereas rightfully so, the FAA will take a lead role on this eventually. We've got this couple of year moratorium that exists right now, and it would be a shame to miss a couple of years worth of private astronaut health data, or adaptation data, as it were. We talking with the Human Research Program, and I'm certainly talking with the leadership of NASA's commercialization initiatives as well, just about this topic, Mike.
Okay, appreciate it. And we definitely want a place for both the commercial world and Dr. Carpentier's data, and certainly to merge with everything that we've already done so far. And new data is going to start flooding in from the new programs. So with that, we've actually gone 90 minutes, which is about a standard ISMS panel. And I really appreciate it. I think there was a very information and data rich set of presentations from the panelists, and there's never enough time to discuss this, but the community knows one another. Dr. Menon, we have your address, we know where you live, and we'll definitely be talking to you about some of the other desirements and questions you have there. So I very much appreciate the panelists today. The inputs were golden, and thank you for the questions that we got from the audience. And with that, I will release everybody out into the world for a lunch or whatever activity you have next on your agendas. So thank you so much for your time.